Today we're talking about 6 things that I'm not a fan of when it comes to the LUMIX S5 Mark IIX. Now, if you're like me, last week you were bombarded with all the news about the LUMIX S5 Mark IIX. And so because of that, I know for myself, I'm really excited and super hype about this camera. But something I want to do today is give you all some counterpoints and some things to think about as far as things that this camera may not have, and maybe some things that I would like to see in future firmware updates with this camera, maybe even a new iteration of this camera down the road. So diving in, the first thing I'm not a huge fan of is the fact that there's no clear indicator of when you are or are not using phase detect autofocus. One of the biggest questions I got when I released my video is, in what modes are you actually using phase detect autofocus, and is it any different with the S5 Mark IIX? I will tell you that the phase detect implementation hasn't changed. Some of the tracking has changed, but the actual implementation of phase detect autofocus hasn't changed between the Mark II and the Mark IIX. Something that I would like to see, or maybe would help clarify everything, is just clear indicators in the software of when you're no longer using phase detect autofocus. So I think it's something that could be easily fixed with a future firmware update, but is one of the first things that I'm not a huge fan of when it comes to this camera. The next thing I'm not a huge fan of is the fact that there's no dedicated dial lock with this camera. Being that this is a camera that is more video centric, and the fact that a lot of videographers and filmmakers often don't change their shutter angle, I would really have liked to see some sort of dial lock. That way the shutter angle doesn't get changed accidentally. Now my workaround for this is using the operation lock option that's in the software, and I have assigned it to a function button. But if you're a power user and already use all your function buttons, that does limit the amount of function buttons you have access to. Now, a fix for this could be a firmware update where you take a page out of the Sigma FP book where you allow for your users to unassign the dial to really any function. That way, if you don't want to ever change your shutter angle, or you want to change it so infrequently, you could basically unassign the dial that's associated with your shutter angle so you don't accidentally adjust your shutter angle when you don't mean to. And so that may be an easy fix with a future firmware update. The next thing I'm not a huge fan of is in regards to the 4K 60 crop. There's a twist to it though, because when it comes down to it, I'm actually okay with the 4K 60 crop. There's not really any camera that offers a full frame 4K 60, especially at this price point. And so having that crop is something that's come to be expected. But the twist in this is I wish that it would go ahead and include 4K 120. Again, that could be a future firmware update and something they include in a future firmware update, but it is something that I don't really like about the camera right now, but again, could be easily solved. The next thing that I'm not really a fan of is the fact that there's no full articulating screen with the S5 Mark IIX. Being the fact that you do rely heavily on the SSD, that means that your USB-C port is going to be often occupied. And the reason why I make that point is with the flippy screen that the S5 IIX does offer, you might run into the fact that the cable for the USB-C will obstruct the articulation of that display. And so because of that, I wish they included a tilting option with the rear display, very similar to the LUMIX GH6. Again, that's not going to be something that this camera has. Maybe it's a new iteration of the camera and it could make the camera more expensive, but that would be something I would like to see. And that actually plays a part into the next thing that I'm not a huge fan of, and that is the over-reliance on the SSD. Now, I have a love-hate relationship with SSD recording. I love it for its convenience and you being able to shoot to the SSD and then go straight into editing, but I don't like it when the camera relies so heavily on the SSD. Now, the fix for this would have been an inclusion of a CFast card slot or a CF Express card slot, and that may mean the camera costs more money and it may be another iteration of this camera, but that's something I would like to see in the future. And that brings me to my last point, and I realize this is very idealistic, just kind of like a wish list thing, but it could potentially be solved in a firmware update, and that is the fact that if I'm recording to an SSD so much, I really wish you would unlock the ability to record RAW to the SSD. Simply put, I'm spoiled by the Sigma FP being able to record uncompressed cinema DNG RAW. I really wish this camera included RAW over SSD. That's a huge ask, and I realize it's probably not going to happen, but that is something that if the equipment can keep up, maybe you do include it with a future firmware update. I'm just saying, LUMIX, if you're listening, RAW over SSD. would be fantastic. And so those are the 6 things that I don't like about the LUMIX S5 Mark IIX. Now let me be clear, this does not deter me from buying this camera or even my excitement around this camera. If you're shopping for this camera and you watch this video, I want you to understand I'm not saying don't buy this camera unless some of these things are deal breakers for you. That's the whole point in me even approaching this video, is I want everyone to make an informed decision of what this camera has and what it doesn't have, or what it can do or what it can't do. I want you to make sure that before you buy this camera, you have all the information you can to make an educated decision. But that said, this camera is dope as hell, and if it makes sense for you, you should buy it. I'm just saying. Affiliate links below. Now, jokes aside, let me know in the comments below, what are some things that you wish this camera had or wish were a little bit different with this camera? Let me know in the comments below. But that's it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did enjoy the video, make sure to give it a like. And if you're digging the overall content from the channel, consider subscribing. As always, thank you for joining. Go and find your journey. Go embrace life. Peace.